Good day. My name is Ed McFerran. Welcome. I am House Counsel for Tax Deferred Exchange Services, which is the company that we use and act as qualified intermediary for the completion of tax deferred exchanges, typically through our law practice. We appreciate your interest in our firm, and we appreciate your interest in tax deferred exchanges. This is a video regarding who can be an exchangor. The question comes up on a pretty regular basis for us. We're going to talk about a variety of topics today in the midst of who can be an exchangor, but we're going to start out very, very basic, and suffice it to say that for tax deferred exchange purposes, as an overall view, we need to have the same exchangor selling the relinquished property as who ultimately acquires the replacement property. Well, at first blush that seems pretty simple, but it is obviously not simple, or otherwise we wouldn't have a long video regarding this particular topic. It produces a variety of situations in which clients create some stress for themselves. So let's pretend, and keep it very simple, that Joe Smith, a single individual, owns a piece of property and wants to hire our firm to provide qualified intermediary services for his tax deferred exchange. We appreciate the opportunity. He will be the exchangor. What is his tax identification number with the Federal Services Internal Revenue Service? His tax identification number, of course, is his Social Security number. So to the degree that his Social Security number and his tax identification number match his relinquished property sale and match his acquisition property purchase, he will be a qualified exchangor. And of course, it seems only appropriate that he be the seller and the purchaser in order to complete a tax deferred exchange. Seems pretty simple. It was intended to be simple just to give us a baseline for understanding. Now, let's complicate matters just a bit. Let's pretend that we have a married couple, and the married couple own a piece of property, but they don't own a piece of property together. Let's pretend that the married couple, and we'll say that Mr. Smith acquired a piece of investment property for purposes of illustration. Let's say that Mr. Smith owned a duplex prior to the time of marrying Mrs. Smith. He kept the duplex separate. It was separate property. He had the full ownership and operation of the duplex. Mrs. Smith, new wife, had no ownership in it and no operational involvement in the duplex. It was Mr. Smith's duplex, notwithstanding that Mr. and Mrs. Smith were married. Who is our exchanger? Well, at first blush, we commonly think that it would be Mr. and Mrs. Smith, because at first blush, we commonly think that Mr. and Mrs. Smith are going to own all of their assets together, when in reality they may. But in reality, they also may not. The key thing is the devil's in the details, and we have to ask the appropriate question: is this property what we would refer to in 8 states of the country as community property, or in the other 42 states we would refer to as marital property, or is this what we refer to in all the 50 states as separate property? Well, it's easy. In this particular example, it is Mr. Smith's separate property. Who's the exchangor? Well, just like the previous example, it's Mr. Smith. It is not Mrs. Smith, it's only Mr. Smith. Well, that's not a problem, because we can complete a tax deferred exchange for Mr. Smith as long as Mr. Smith relinquishes the sale property and as long as Mr. Smith acquires the replacement property. So far, so good. Seems like a very simple example, except for one problem. Mr. Smith wants to acquire a replacement property that may involve financing. Mr. Smith may not personally and individually have the financial wherewithal in order to qualify for financing without the help and assistance of new wife. And in that case, the banker becomes the determining factor, when in reality the banker, in order to acquire the replacement property, may specifically require that Mrs. Smith be on the loan, which means that Mrs. Smith must also be on the property. Folks, this is a reason why we talk about this subject well before the listing of properties for sale, because in reality, we ask clients in order to vet themselves out or qualify for financing or take a look and make sure that they'll be able to complete the tax-deferred exchange, because in reality, if it's determined ultimately that the property has to be marital community property or community property itself, then the parties can take the appropriate steps in order to accomplish that well before listing the property for sale, well before entering into a purchase and sale agreement, and hopefully well before the closing of the transaction. So it's important to understand that in some cases a party may separately be able to complete a tax-deferred exchange from their marital community. In other cases, from a practical reality, we may have to have the property vested in the marital community in order for them to qualify for financing of that property in the future. So in this particular instance, if they did combine the properties together, that certainly matters that can be handled in all the states. It doesn't produce a taxable event at all. But the marital community would then become the exchangor, and the two tax identification numbers would be representative of that particular tax-deferred exchange. Other times, we also have to take a look at properties that are co-owned. If the property is owned by an LLC, we also have to ask the question, is the LLC a particular type of LLC that has its own tax identification number? If it is, that particular LLC, limited liability company, can very well be the exchangor. That limited liability company may very well also be the acquirer of the replacement property and be the same tax identification number for both the relinquished and the replacement property. However, what happens if one member, that's the party, that's the name that we give to owners of the LLC, what happens if one member wants to complete a tax-deferred exchange, but another member wants to complete just a sale? How do we handle those? Well, we have ways of handling those, and those are beyond the scope of this short video, of course. Those are questions that you need to bring in and talk with our staff in order for us to possibly reconstruct that LLC in order to allow that type of transaction to occur. The key thing that we're talking about here today, the key issue that shows up in our practice, is typically marital community ownership. If you are listening to this video and you are owning a property that's not owned by the marital community, please listen up. The suggestion will be is before you list your property for sale, that you look to see what you're going to acquire and talk with a mortgage lender, a banker, a lender of some sort that can pre-qualify you to make sure that you feel comfortable in being able to qualify for the acquisition loan associated with the purchase of your replacement property. I have to tell you, many, many times, I don't have a specific statistic, but I would say 60 to 70% of the cases that we're involved in, the lender will require the marital community to be the borrower for the acquisition of the replacement property. If that is true, it's incumbent upon us to change the status of ownership of the relinquished property well before closing, and of course, it can't happen after closing. If it were to happen after closing, it would result in only the exchanger completing a half exchange because the spouse would be acquiring the replacement property in ownership status as well. This is a complicated area, well beyond the scope of a video like this. It prompts us to suggest that if you are in this situation or if you have questions in this regard, please contact our staff. We have staff available from 8:30 in the morning till 5 o'clock, phone, fax, email, courier pigeon, whatever it takes. We're there to answer your specific questions, and we do have the capabilities and qualifications to do so. So I thank you for listening to this video, and hopefully it helps you in your determination of who is the exchangor. Thank you.